officially say good evening. Oh, we can do better. Good evening. There we go. Okay. Thank you again. My name is Ben Dworkin. I am the director of the Rebovich Institute for New Jersey Politics here at Rider University. And on behalf of Rider and the Rebovich Institute, welcome to an evening with Jim Johnson. Tonight is part of our ongoing lecture series that we call the Governing New Jersey series. It's also our first official event for this school year, and we could not be more excited. Now, one of our traditions is that we ask you right now, please, to take out your cell phone, your smartphone, and to take a selfie of you and your table right now and put it on social media. Come on, you guys are young. I know you have this and everything. And post it and tell them where you are and say, and make everybody who's not here jealous. Okay, so I'm doing this too. That's a keeper. Okay. And once you've posted it on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, then you can turn the phone off, please. Here at the Rebovich Institute for New Jersey Politics, we have two primary missions. The first is to raise the level of political discourse. With programs like tonight, we hope to make everyone a little bit smarter. And when everyone is better informed, we can all make a more enlightened discussion about how to face the challenges facing our great state in the future. Now, the second part of our mission is to train the next generation of political leaders, something that our speaker tonight has been committed to throughout his career in public life. The Rebovich Institute provides career services ranging from how to build your resume, how to give a real handshake, how to give an elevator pitch, how to make the most out of that political internship. And those political internships are something we emphasize significantly here at the Institute, trying to place people, trying to help them figure out what would be the first step towards a life as an active and engaged citizen in politics, in government, in public affairs, and advocacy. And because so many of these internships, these valuable, critical summer political internships for college students today are unpaid, the Rebovich Institute now provides what this past summer was more than $20,000 in scholarship money for our students who take on these unpaid internships to make it a little bit easier on them. Those who receive an intern scholarship are called Rebovich Fellows. And so I'd like everyone who is a current or past Rebovich Fellow to just please stand up and be recognized. There are a few of you here. Come on. Thank you. These are outstanding students. They took on an unpaid internship because they know the benefits of what it's going to mean for them down the road. Here's how tonight's program is going to work. I'm going to introduce a Rider student who will then introduce Mr. Johnson. At the conclusion of Mr. Johnson's remarks, we will open it up for questions. As is our tradition, the first two questions need to come from Rider students. So you guys come up with something, okay? So make sure you're ready. Please note that this is being recorded. This is an on-the-record event. All remarks should be considered on the record. Now, during the question and answer session, we will have two student volunteers holding wireless microphones. It's not particularly a huge room, and even if you have a booming voice, if Mr. Johnson picks you to ask a question, please wait till you're holding one of the mics. It allows us, for the recording on the DVD that we're going to have in the library, in our files for the future, it allows us to actually hear what the question was. So just wait until the person comes to you with the wireless mic. This will really help us. Now, to introduce our guest speaker, I ask that you all please welcome a master's degree student in our School of Education, Ms. Danielle Jones.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Dworkin. I am truly appreciated and honored for this opportunity to introduce tonight's speaker, Mr. Jim Johnson. Mr. Johnson was born and raised in Montclair, New Jersey. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in History from Harvard in 1983 and then graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1986. Mr. Johnson worked as assistant for U.S. District Attorney for the Southern District of New York. In 1993, he relocated to Washington, D.C., and served many high-ranking positions in the Department of Treasury under President Bill Clinton, including as the Undersecretary for Treasury Enforcement in 1998. In this role, he oversaw the operations of approximately 1/3 of all federal law enforcement, including the United States Secret Service, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and United States Customs Service. As the Undersecretary, he managed 29,000 employees and a budget of $6.4 billion. After leaving the Clinton administration, Mr. Johnson returned to Montclair and worked as a private sector lawyer. During this time, he led New Jersey's Advisory Committee on Police Standards to address and eliminate racial profiling by New Jersey state troopers. He has been instrumental in improving relationships between law enforcement and civilian leadership. Since 2014, Mr. Johnson has been hands-on with his involvement in New Jersey Communities Forward, a project within the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. New Jersey Communities Forward, or NJCF, is an initiative focused on building healthy, safe, and sustainable urban communities through developing relationships and encouraging partnerships between residents, community activists, and law enforcement. The work being done by New Jersey Communities Forward is a valuable bridge to build substantial relationships and develop effective community-based solutions. Let me just say that having family members that were raised in Montclair, as well as family and law enforcement, it's wonderful and inspiring to see a person like Mr. Johnson who continues to fight for civil rights, justice, and equality. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and fellow students, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Johnson.
Thank you for that really kind introduction. Sounded like it was written by a family member. Go deep, build strong, stand tall. I want you to hold these three ideas in mind because we need it right now, and we need so many of you. All you have to do, and all of us probably do over the last week, 2 weeks, 6 months since November, is keep track of the news in the national level, at the state level, and realize that this nation needs your fresh blood and your energy and your ideas. And I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that my generation is leaving for you. And I want you to stay here in this state. If you look at the state landscape right now, there are a couple of things, particularly if you look just at the demographic levels, that we ought to worry about. We talked a lot in the campaign that our economy has not followed the progress of the rest of the nation. We've been slow in recovery. We've had an uptick lately, but we've been slow. We have talked about, and I talked about a lot, our high foreclosure rate. And we still lead the nation in that. But I want to talk about something that's different. I want to actually go to fundamentals, which is why I'm talking about dig deep. Very often in political campaigns, we talk about issues. And we want to hear about, the public wants to hear about, and we want to deliver messages around our stance on particular issues. But if we are going to get out of the mess that we're in right now, we actually have to talk about our approaches to each other, to the big problems, and to the direction that we want to head. I believe the state, as part of this nation, has some serious searching to do for deeper answers. So what do I mean when I say, first, dig deep? James Baldwin said that to fix a problem, you have to face the problem. And for years, whether or not you've been talking about our schools, when you talk about our economy, even when you're talking about issues of race relations or the way we do our politics, we kind of skitter along the surface. We don't ask ourselves the hard and deep questions. And for the political scientists, I'll give you one quick example, then I'll show you what I mean. In Washington, there was a problem with the Jefferson Memorial. The granite along the side was deteriorating. And they were trying to figure out, why was the granite deteriorating? Well, they decided that what had happened was that there were birds that were visiting the monument a lot more often, and so they had to wash it. Birds doing what birds do, they had to wash it a lot more frequently, and so that was causing the granite to deteriorate. First order of business, okay, we've solved the problem, it's the birds, so let's kill the birds. All right, then they said, well, wait a second, let's think a little bit more deeply here. Why are the birds coming? Well, the birds were coming because there were spiders all around the Jefferson Memorial, and the birds were coming to eat the spiders. Oh, great, fine, we've solved the problem. Let's kill the spiders. Well, somebody said, well, people are not going, we're part of the Park Service. That's not going to work, so let's not kill the spiders. Why are the spiders coming? Well, the spiders were coming because they were there to eat these small bugs that look sort of like mosquitoes called midges. And the spiders were coming to feast on the midges. Great. Let's go back to killing something again. Let's kill the midges. And then somebody said, well, wait a second. Why are the midges coming? The answer was this. They were coming because they were attracted to this white marble edifice that was huge, and it was lit at night, and midges' brains act like moth's brains, and so they were just coming to the light. And they finally figured out the problem. Turn the lights off at dusk. And they solved the problem. That's what I mean by digging deep. So I'm going to take you from Washington to the Arizona desert, and we'll make this even more relevant for you. When I was Undersecretary of the Treasury, the Secret Service, the Customs Service, they both reported to me. And that meant that there were over 21,000 people just in those organizations reporting to me. At that time, we were very concerned, as we are now, about terrorism. And so we put together Secret Service agents and customs agents who were able to fly Black Hawk helicopters to create counter-assault teams. These counter-assault teams were then going to fire at whatever terrorists were attacking the Washington monuments, the White House, whatever the threat was going to be. My job as Undersecretary was to make sure that they were doing their jobs appropriately, which took me to Arizona. And so I was in one of their helicopters. And I don't know if any of you know, Black Hawk helicopters are among the largest helicopters. They're used by the military. They're also used in civilian service. They are monster machines. And I was in the back of it. We had a full team of agents we were flying at dusk. So you imagine we are flying through the night sky. They're using tracer rounds, which are bullets that glow orange when they're hitting the targets on the ground. We're inside a beast of a machine, and it's just like you can feel it in your rib cage. You can feel it really in your spine that this is nothing but power. And as we were firing and they were training, they turned to me and they said, "Mr. Secretary," yes, I should have said copy, but my training hadn't gone that far. Would you like to fire off a few rounds? And they were carrying MP5 submachine guns, very powerful weapons. The shell casings were hot, and they were coming back, and a couple were hitting. What we didn't want to do, you didn't want to get a shell casing between your collar of your flight suit and your skin, because that could ruin your whole day. And so they said, do you want to fire? And in the back of my head, I said, yes, I will kill the target. And then I realized, that's not my job. Said, no, that's a negative, sir. All right, Mr. Secretary, are you sure? Yes, negative. Because I had a picture of the Washington Post article about my shooting myself in the foot in a Black Hawk helicopter above Arizona. What's important about that story is going to be relevant when I talk to you about law enforcement and the way we need to think about law enforcement issues going forward. The key thing is this. I had a particular job in that aircraft, which was to supervise. I almost changed my role and my job and my approach because my integration with that machine, the feeling that was inside me, the adrenaline rush, was affecting my judgment. That's a lesson that I carried forward and carry forward as I still think about law enforcement and what's in the field. Second stop, we're going now from Arizona to Camden, New Jersey. During the campaign, one of the things that you do in a campaign is a lot of meet and greet. Maybe I could have used some of the training on handshakes because you do a lot of meet and greet in a campaign. And one of the places that I went to was T.I.'s Barbershop on, I believe, Haddonfield Avenue in Camden. It is a place where many people make stops along the campaign trail. This was late on a Monday evening. We were talking, and I was doing more listening because I think you get smarter by listening than you by talking. And we were having a really good conversation about police community relations, about economic development in Camden, and then a young man came in. And the young man, T.I. introduced us, and he didn't smile. And T.I. said, well, you should see this because so many of our young people do not smile because the level of trauma in Camden is so high. And that stuck with me. And we need to hold on to that for a second as well. The third stop, so we're moving from Arizona to Camden. Now we're going to go back to Colorado. In 1999, in Columbine, Colorado, 13 people, 12 students and one teacher were killed by two young men, gunmen, who had guns who shouldn't have had them. My agents were ATF agents, so I've spoken about the Secret Service, I've spoken about the Customs Service. Another group of my agents were ATF agents. They were asked to respond to the scene of that crime. Because I was their boss, I was asked to go later on, not a week later or 2 weeks later, but a couple of days after, to see what my agents were doing, to do an assessment of the resources that were needed, and also to think through, because that was my job as a policy officer, how we could prevent something like that from happening again. When I met the agents, most of them had been on the job for a decade or more. They were clearly shaken. They gave me a briefing in the station, and then rather in their office, and then we went to the school. I walked through the front door, and it could have been this. It was a high school, but it could have been this school, to the extent that there were signs around. There was a student government campaign that was ongoing, but it was still, because it had become a crime scene. And then they took me to the library, which is where 10 people had their lives snatched away from them. And it was still an actively investigated crime scene, which was awful. Because it was my job to be a leader, and I had to be focused on, okay, what do we do next? It was not for me at that moment to cry. What I did do was advocate for certain changes in the law to make sure that gun shows, that young 16-year-old kids couldn't buy long guns at gun shows. And then I went to a gun show myself undercover and went to Congress to testify to close what's known as the gun show loophole, which basically is a gap in the law where you could go to a gun show and without a background check buy a weapon because you'd be buying from someone who's a private seller. The problem with doing it as gun shows is that if at every single table in this room there's a private seller selling different sort of guns, that for me as a person buying the guns, I'm looking at this room like it's a store. And in many cases, we had many people that, bad actors who could never purchase guns from a gun dealer, purchasing the weapons from the store. I walked away from that as an advocate, but years later, that trauma came back to me. After Sandy Hook, you remember Sandy Hook, where, again, you had someone who never should have had access to guns, killing a large number of people, not even people, babies. And we still couldn't fix the law. And then there was a film about it. And then I was asked to screen the film and talk to the public about it. And there was this moment in the film where Monsignor talks about walking into the school, just like I walked into Columbine, and then stepping on glass, just like I had in Columbine, and then seeing where the children had been killed. And 18 years later, tears came to me, and they didn't stop. And I stood in front of the people to do the screening of the film and interview the director, and I said, folks, this is going to be a post-film screening unlike any other because I can't stop crying. Why did I tell these three stories? Again, going deep. One of the things that we need to do in this state going forward is deal with the trauma that so many people have had in this state. It is the trauma related to loss of home. In some areas, it's a trauma related to a loss of a sense of safety in our communities. It is the trauma that law enforcement has. And I've written about this, that one of the things we do as we continue to try to improve the relations between police and the communities they serve is to understand the trauma of law enforcement. There's lots of studies about that, but I just told you a story that's personal about my personal experience in dealing with one traumatic incident. And what is going to be necessary for those of you who are young leaders, those of you who are older leaders, and those of you who are venerated leaders, is actually to go deep and try to get us from a point where so many of us within the state for years, there's been just screaming back and forth without progress, and in this nation, where we have reached a point where the whole idea that Dr. Dworkin was talking about of sensible dialogue has really been lost. You cannot reduce the fate of a nation down to a Twitter stream. You can maybe mislead it, you can perhaps even destroy it, but you cannot make reasoned judgments and lead a people through Twitter, much as all of us now use it. What's going to be required is thoughtful leadership, and New Jersey is in the middle of that mix. We have some of the toughest problems in this state over the last, some of which have been developing and getting worse over decades, and over leadership that's been both Republican and Democrat. We have to bear down on that, but we can't solve it simply by either shouting or by deciding, well, you know something, I'm going to win this one, because our problems are just too complex to do that. We have a significant pension problem, which is going to take funding. We have problems in the funding of some of our schools. We have a host of issues around building affordable housing. And it's not just because of the families that currently need affordable housing, but a big problem for the future of this state is the fact that millennials, when you graduate, your friends who have already graduated and those somewhat above you are leaving this state. We need to engage with you as the leadership today is thinking about decisions that will affect whether or not you can get a job here or need to leave and go someplace else. On the campaign, I spoke to a mother and father who had lived in New Jersey for 30 years. Their kids were in college, and he turned to me, and the dad turned to me and he said, this is great, glad you're running, but my kid's coming home, gonna graduate from school soon, and I'm telling them, don't go back to New Jersey. Don't go back to New Jersey. We have to change that, and you can help us figure some of these issues out. We have right now, in the last census, among other things they do, is they test civic engagement. That is the level of participation in the process, the government process, the community process, by ordinary citizens. New Jersey is in the bottom 5, if not bottom 5, bottom 10 of all states in terms of civic engagement. We have been in the bottom of all states in terms of voter participation. All of these things need to be turned around because our problems are so difficult that we can't afford to have people on the sidelines, and we surely can't have this talent leave us when we need some of the best solutions and the best thinking on very, very tough problems. And when I said we needed to go deep, part of it is we need to think deeply about how we are talking to each other, not just the mechanics of it, but whether or not we are actually prepared to both talk and listen to each other. I campaigned, before I was campaigning for my own candidacy, I was campaigning for Secretary Clinton in Philadelphia. And I did something that the campaign instructed me not to do. I talked to people who said they were not going to vote. They were Democrats who said they were not going to vote for Secretary Clinton. They were going to vote for Donald Trump, or they were not going to vote at all. And the campaigns, with those who hadn't decided, we were supposed to persuade, but if someone had said, I'm voting for Trump, the instructions were, save your time, go and motivate our voters. I don't always follow instructions, so I stayed and I listened to some of the Trump voters. And I talked to some whose hair was on fire with conspiracy theories. But here's what else I heard, and we have to work through this. I heard, I have lost a sense of community. I don't have a good job. I'm tired of being told who my leader is supposed to be and what they're supposed to look like and sound like. And then one gentleman who was not African American looked at me and he said, and this is one I want to talk to you about, on race. And I sort of stepped back thinking, what in the world is going to come at me? And this is what he said. I served in Vietnam. I served with black soldiers. We were brothers. We were here, and now we're here. And I want to change that. And then I was moved on to a couple of other doorsteps, and there were a handful of Trump supporters who said, I'm not even talking to you, no. But then there was one woman who had a Blue Lives Matter poster on her fence. And I said, I want to hear what she has to say. And we talked, and she was initially not really interested terribly in talking to us. And I explained to her that I'd been a federal prosecutor, that I had served in law enforcement. And then she said, well, thank you for your service. and something snapped and changed. Because all of a sudden she had a base. I went outside of the box of being just another person trying to persuade her to vote for a candidate to someone who she could tell a story about. I was a former law enforcement person. And then we talked for a while, and she talked again about the sorts of things that she wanted to see in the world. Again, it was about community. There were young people behind us, 3 boys. One was maybe 8, one was 9, and the other one was like, we would have called him like Petey or something because he was about 5. And 2 black, 1 white. And they were keeping up a noise, and I actually hadn't been paying any attention to him, but she was, because this was her neighborhood, her community. And she looked over my shoulder, and she said, initially, "Boys, stop it." And I said, "What's coming?" And then she said, "Come on, that's no way to treat your friends." That's how she was engaging with community, and she wasn't trying to separate the 2 young African-American boys from the white young man, the white boy either, the 3 boys. Instead, she was trying to bring them together. So when I say go deep, it means we can't stop at the first level explanations that we were constantly giving about why the election turned out the way it did the last time. There are people with stories behind the results, and those stories require us to take the time to listen to them, understand them, learn from them. The next day, I was at Shiloh Baptist Church. My mother had been a church organist there in Newark, New Jersey. And they were celebrating their 110th anniversary. And during the pastoral prayer, remember what I'd heard on the doorstep in Philadelphia? I heard we'd lost a sense of community. We wanted good jobs. We were being told who our leaders were. Well, in the pastoral prayer in an African-American Baptist church in Newark, New Jersey, I was hearing some of the same things I was hearing from Trump supporters on the doorstep in Philadelphia. We're not being listened to. We've lost a sense of community. We need good jobs. We don't have a choice in who our leaders are. 2 different places, 2 different races, same stories. The next set of leaders in New Jersey needs to help work through that and solve that and bring us together, particularly given our current historical moment on the national scale. For me, the answer on, as we talk about what's been going on in Washington and the really for 2017 to be having the sorts of debates many of us thought we had resolved in 1968, 69 about what our core values were. It is a very hard thing, but that's because we didn't solve things, and we really do need to solve things. One of the approaches that I believe is, again, I mentioned early on that we talk as politicians very often, we talk as leaders about issues. I want to talk about visions that come from a vision of solutions that comes from community. I believe that this nation became great because of strong communities. I believe that this state, as complicated as its political landscape is, has incredibly strong communities that can be much stronger. But how do we build that? How do we provide the fiber that's necessary to knit one of us to the other? The fabric that enables us to create a beautiful communal quilt. Well, I'm going to tell you about what we did in New Jersey Communities Forward. And it's an approach to both community building that can be applied to our toughest problems. I will talk to you a little bit about what I was able to do with this approach with housing, as we have to solve our housing, our really affordable housing crisis. And it also feeds into the issues of policing. Rather, not just policing, but education. So first, with policing. After Ferguson blew up, and after the Garner decision, which most of you will remember was where grand jury in Staten Island decided not to indict, not to charge anyone in connection with the death of Eric Garner, who had been selling 6, loose cigarettes. And many of us saw the videotape in which he died while saying, "I can't breathe," in a chokehold. A group of people came together and said, we're going to do something different. It was the NAACP and the Black Issues Convention and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the Integrated Justice Alliance. We were connected to the Attorney General's office. And we built something called New Jersey Communities Forward. And what we did with that organization was create a space in which we could actually talk to each other across the usual barriers that divide us. And so in 8 different communities around the state, in rooms that looked a lot like this, at round tables, you had sometimes very senior law enforcement people, including the state's Attorney General, John Hoffman, participated in a couple of these events. The U.S. Attorney at the time, Paul Fishman, also participated. Side by side with people that routinely protested against them, and with young people who often would want to have nothing to do with them. And they talked through hard issues. Often, they ended up talking about, we started maybe talking about body cams and implicit bias training, but in many of the sessions, we also ended up talking about, they moved from those issues to talking about the impact of poverty on the choices that people have and make. And the lack of opportunity in our urban areas. This was important because out of this, as was mentioned, we developed solutions. We worked with the Attorney General so that New Jersey became one of the first states with a statewide body cam policy. That was not the result of us hammering at each other, but having thoughtful conversation. We became one of the first states that had a policy on implicit bias training for law enforcement. Again, it didn't come about because they were screaming at each other, but because we created enough space for people of goodwill to figure out how do we move forward. The work wasn't necessarily exciting. It wasn't very dramatic, but it's the sort of thing that over time can enable people to do what they want to do, which is have vibrant communities, safe communities, and be engaged with each other in a way that doesn't give us all agita. That's important. In Westchester County, I was a court-appointed monitor to represent the court's interests in an affordable housing settlement. Westchester had not built affordable housing at the level that HUD had expected it to, and it was not marketing that housing to what the regulations call those least likely to apply, which were blacks and Hispanics, both in Westchester County and in the areas. And as you can imagine, one of the problems with building affordable housing is that people often will say, not in my backyard. Well, we developed, and I won't go into detail here about it, a community-based process, which, like the law enforcement process, involved people around the table in a space where they could actually figure out problems instead of looking for obstacles. And many communities that had, at least two communities that had said, this can't possibly be done. We can't build the affordable housing where you want it built. We can't do the sort of marketing outside of our area that you want done. Left those discussions and left those trainings of how to have the conversation. How do we use technology to show what a building will actually look like, what its impact will be on schooling? How do we make things concrete that right now are just scary to people? They left these discussions and they said, we can do this. That is the sort of thinking, particularly applying technology to hard social problems, that the next generation of leaders that are sitting in this room and the next set of leaders that are going to be sitting in Trenton are going to have to or should apply when they are thinking through how to resolve these tough problems in the Garden State. The final piece that I want to talk about, how the community can be brought to bear and what it means to think deep, is on the education front. We always believe that we can do better when it comes to educating young people. We hope that we are going to do things to deal with the achievement gap. And we have a school funding formula that is at least intended to provide better education for all of our kids. But we also know that that's not happening. And so this is one of those areas where you say, well, what does it mean to think deeply about what it takes to educate a kid? Studies have shown that by the time some of our children get to school, to kindergarten, they've got 12 million words that they've heard. And their minds are just popping and brimming and ready to take knowledge in. But some other children arrive at school with just 4 million words. So already at kindergarten, there's an 8 million word gap, which means also that there's going to be somewhat of a developmental gap. And so one of the things that the reason why when I campaigned, I was campaigning for pre-K education, was that you want to actually engage with children so much earlier. And we can. But this is, again, where we're going to have to think creatively about how we deal with our money situations, because pre-K for all children will cost money. But it's something that we can plan and build for if we say, we are going to set that as a goal. And I think that it is essential, if this is to be a state for all of our children, is if we set big goals, even in areas where in this fiscal year we don't have the money, but in next fiscal year we might, or we can plan for it and make sure that the prosperity that I hope is going to come back to the state is a prosperity that's shared, and that this state, which is right now suffers from massive inequality, becomes a state where all of our children and all of the people within the state are actually sharing and trying to move us all forward. So I started with the word go deep and build strong. And I talked about some of the components of what building a strong community looks like. That's building with police, building in our schools, literally building homes for people to live in affordably. And then my last piece was stand tall. And this is where I leave New Jersey and think and really put New Jersey in a broader context. We have had cities decimated by hurricanes. On the West Coast, we have, I was speaking to a friend who lives in Washington, and she's worried about the air that she breathes because of the fires there. 80%, it's estimated, of Puerto Rico's crops have been destroyed by hurricane, maybe more. And the island, some need to be informed that it is actually part of the United States, and others need to be informed that there are U.S. citizens that live there. The island is suffering horrifically. These are huge problems. But we live in a political moment right now where the instinct has not been to pull us all together, but instead to divide us one from each other. To openly criticize, not just from the White House, criticize in a way that makes many of us just want to put our heads down in shame, athletes that are exercising their First Amendment rights. We have a president who has tried to set us one from the other, first against Muslims, then against Mexicans, and then we're talking about during the campaign. And then with language that is just, it is so beneath the office of the presidency of the United States, telling owners that they should tell their sons of bitches, basically, to stand up and act right and just simply comply. Now, one way to respond to that, and it's important, is to speak out and speak truth that that is wrong. But the other way to do that is not simply saying, I'm going to choose the side of people that looks like me versus the side of people that looks like the president. There are some people who say, well, now's the time to choose sides. And maybe they interpret it by saying blacks should choose blacks, whites should choose whites, that Muslims should stay together, that Hispanics who are worried about ICE should simply stay home. But to me, that's a set of choices that say we choose chaos. I don't choose chaos. I choose community. I don't choose disorder where we have North Korea that thinks that we've declared war on them, and we take the eye off of that particular ball to pick a fight with the National Football League. That is the way of chaos. The answer, as Martin Luther King so often said, was community. For many, when they think about community, they think about maybe a group of people that all looks the same, that all thinks the same, that all wants the same thing. I've never aspired to such a community. I think most families aren't even like that, let alone most communities. For me, community is strong enough when it works that it can hold and provide space for disagreements. It means that I may not agree with your position on taxes, but I will defend your right to have that position, and I will not use my position to try to destroy you because you want something else. That is the community that we should be working towards and trying to achieve. A community looks out for those of us who are weak, who are in need. It is one of the reasons why I joined so many others in opposing the efforts to first repeal and replace, then the repeal, then I don't know what the effort is now, the Affordable Care Act. A community that is great looks out for the least among us. A community that is wise gives opportunity to all the talents within us. The next set of leaders in this state, and I have a favorite, has to help us become great again by making our communities great, by seeing community as embracing all of us, by working hard to see that our young people have the opportunities that many of us 20 years ago took for granted and so many of us now know we can't. I'm looking forward to working with my candidate to bring that community. And whether or not Phil Murphy wins, I will work with the people of the state because community matters. It is essential to us. It is what will enable us to sustain ourselves on this precious planet. I am so excited to be with you all here today, to see and learn more about the work of the Institute, and to see the young people who are not only practicing their handshakes, but many of them are, I know, political science majors, and there are going to be two that are going to be asking me questions that I can't answer. I know that. You all are going to be the bedrock of community now. Right now, you're probably the energy of many of your communities. In 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to be the bedrock of the community. We need you to stay in this state. We need you to build up us again, work with us side by side, and lead the way. And I'm looking forward to that. Because the other way is chaos. We can't have that. So thank you so much for having me here. I hope that if most of the people in some way, if you're here on this night, you're probably politically engaged. Stay engaged. Do more. We can always do more. Push hard. Believe that we can actually achieve much better communities, that this chaos is short-lived, that it may not burn itself out, but we can snuff it out. But we snuff it out together. We build together, and we will rise together. Thank you so much.
You stay here. You stay here. There's a water tank. So
Okay.
you're good enough.
I stay here? All right.
Yeah, you can stay here. So questions, just raise your hand. Mr. Johnson will pick you. Students, we're counting on you to come up with something.
Students are the first two, right?
First two, and then you can open up to everybody.
Okay.
But just pick, and when you pick, wait till a microphone cuts to you.
I want to say Alexis. Okay.
Hi, my name is Alexis Bailey. I'm a sophomore political science and communications major. My question is, what is the biggest lesson you learned running a statewide campaign?
So the question is, what is the biggest I learned in the statewide campaign? Here's what I was surprised by. Campaigning, what for me was like falling in love. Complete with heartache. But the big thing was this. Within this state, we have so many people that are doing in quiet ways phenomenal things. One of the images that I kept in mind for the last 2.5 months in the campaign was a mother in Trenton whose son was killed at 19 in a drive-by shooting. He was in college. He was actually getting ready to transfer to college, to another college. He was going into his sophomore year. He was with a group of friends at, I think it was a neighborhood cookout, and there was a person who decided to shoot up the block. He actually stepped in front of the bullets and protected two young women who were friends of his. They lived. He died. When she told me this story, it took my breath away. And then she said this: I had lost my son. I was never going to see him walk across the graduation stage and take a diploma. But I could start a scholarship in his name, and I would see other people walk across the stage and receive their college diplomas. And that's what she did. Hers was the most powerful of the stories that I heard, and the most powerful presence of the many that I had. But there were, in almost every city and in towns around the state, if you spent time, as I was able to do, listening to people and hearing their dreams as well as their struggles, you end up falling in love. That was not what I was expecting of the many things. I had a pretty good sense of the mechanics of it. I had a pretty good sense of what the politics would look like. I had a very strong sense that it would be among the very most challenging things that I would do, but I did not expect to be swept off my feet, and I was. Now, you're accounting, but I can't remember what your first name was.
Josh,
Right? Josh.
I wanted to ask, do you believe the polls played a big role in affecting the outcome of your recent bid for governor?
So did the polls play a role in the outcome? I haven't thought of it. I've never thought of it that way, that the polls made an effect. But I think that the outcome was shaped in part by the sense that the outcome was inevitable, and to the extent that the polls factored into that, it became part of a reinforcing cycle. But that said, it was always going to be a tough campaign, and I knew that. Phil Murphy is a highly qualified person who also had a very strong campaign operation. Those are two pretty tough things to overcome in any sort of campaign. But the sense of inevitability into which some of the polling fed could have played a factor in it. That's right, I pick. All right, we will go, okay, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I'm a theater and political science double major here at Rider. I saw in your bio that you're a champion for the arts. So my question is, what steps have you taken to promote arts advocacy during your time?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? So my mother's a musician and an educator, and I grew up in a house in which everybody sang, everybody played an instrument, and I did not play. I played the trumpet badly, which is really a bad instrument to play badly in the house, right? So I had a short-lived career as a trumpet player, but I grew up. I have an uncle who worked in the advertising industry, but he was a painter. And my dad was, he loved reading. I grew up in a household in which all of this was part of what made a life full. So pivot forward. What are the things that I've done now? I'm on the board of the Montclair Film Festival. And part of the reason I'm on the board of the film festival is that I believe that, I'll step one step back. I believe strongly that one of the ways that we bind ourselves together in community is actually through creative expression, through the arts, not only in the consumption of it, but also in the making of it. And I think all of us has a little bit of an artist inside him or her. And so I'm a member of the Montclair Film Festival board. One reason that I do that is that in my mind, communities used to come together around campfires and tell each other stories, and that's what binds us together. Now the campfire is the light from the projectionist booth and the stories on the screen, but at least we're together. And in the film festival, we emphasize there's a significant component of stories that are about what any one of us would call the other, because we have a diverse array of directors that come to support the efforts of the film festival. So that's one. I was for many years on the board of the Montclair Art Museum, and I helped support a program called Art Start, which takes, there's a Head Start program in my town, a couple of them, but one is the Montclair Child Development Center, and it gets the kids out of the Child Development Center, and it gets them into the art museum, where they might not otherwise see some of the fine art. And we have some great masters there. But it also provides art teaching training to their teachers. And the third piece is that it provides training to parents and opportunities for parents to make art with their children. That's important for several reasons. One, it's just good to be close in with children. And when I mentioned before about the millions of word gaps, 4 million on some kids, 12 million on others, one way to bridge that gap is to get parents and children on projects, or caregivers and children on projects together, rather than the project that you see so often now, where what they're doing together is looking at their iPhones, as opposed to talking to each other. So that's one reason. Two is if we're successful in building the habits of working with children on the art making, then when the children get to school, it's much less of a leap to be in the habit of actually reading with them and doing that work with them. So that's another, that's, a lot of the things that I do are dual purpose, but that's another way that I support the arts. And there's more, but we need time to answer some other questions. Let's see. Not in the green, but in the lighter shirt right behind you was the next person.
Hello, I'm Antonio, and I'm a sophomore here at Rider. If you can go back in time to your campaign and can change one thing about it, what would it be? And do you feel that one change will make an impact on the results?
The one thing, if I could go back in time, If I could go back in time, I would have used that time machine to start my campaign earlier. And I think that would have been something that was helpful. But I also know this. I have a friend who was governor of Massachusetts, and he said, one of the things you need to do before you run, you need to decide on those issues that you would be prepared to lose over. And one of the things that I had going on was I was a court officer for a matter in Westchester County. The end of my assignment was going to be in August of 2016, and I couldn't start a political campaign and discharge my function as a court officer. And it was very important to me for me to finish that job before starting the next one. And who knows what could have happened if I had had such a time machine and I could have started earlier. But call it principled, call it mule-headed. That was an important factor. Let's see, we had 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go to the back. Yes.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Rivera. I'm a senior philosophy major here at Rider. You mentioned earlier about police trauma. I would love to tap into your wisdom and experience with racial tension between police and different race groups and classes of people. As a community, if I could flip the script, because a lot of times you talk about what the police can do, and I do believe that in some ways we're trying our best, but as a community, what can we do to increase that sense of community and help with the trauma that I'm sure many police officers do? You mentioned police trauma. Mm-hmm. If you could allude to some of those and perhaps ways we can aid in that.
So when I worked for President Clinton, my first meeting with him was in the White House, the Oval Office, the first time I actually got a chance to speak to him one-on-one. And I managed not to have my voice shaking. I had been helping to lead the investigation of fires that had been arsons of black churches in the South. And he asked me how it was, and I started to go through how it was, and I gave him basically a very dry recitation of the facts and assignments and anything. And he goes, "Jim," "Yes, Mr. President," "show them that you care." And so very often what we do, and it's the simple things, the small things, but there's a programmatic approach of showing on both sides that there's caring. I have proposed that young officers be involved in mentoring, community mentoring, but it's not the typical thing where you think of an officer going and mentoring a young person in the community. It's actually flipping, as you said, sort of flipping the script, that you would have an older member of a community, someone who had been there for a long time, 50, 60, 70 years old, who would serve as a mentor for the young officer coming on board. You start there and build the relationship. But what I believe that relationship, that mentoring relationship can switch is a script that's sometimes in the officer's head, which is they're the one with the authority as opposed to community members also having authority, and that there's a shared responsibility for what happens in the community, the shared responsibility that you would point towards. That's one. Two, they become, if this were to occur, you would end up getting much better information between the information flow between community members and officers, which can help in enforcement activities. And then three, it is what can happen is that, I talked a little bit about implicit bias. One of the things that affects bias is familiarity. And so as you create greater familiarity and create greater bonds between community members and law enforcement, some of the issues of implicit bias, not all of them, can be weakened. And I'll tell you a quick story about my own story on me about how implicit bias works. I have a family that looks like America. I recently got remarried, and my wife is white. And so the nieces and nephew that came along with the marriage is also white. And so when our kids get together, people look at us, they can't figure it out us. They're thinking like, are you guys a school group? It's like, no, actually we're a family. And so I was at my older daughter's college, and she sang in the gospel chorus, which looked like a gospel chorus, largely African American, with a handful of white students and a handful of I think there were 1 or 2 Chinese American students, and I was looking at one of the students. She was brunette, and I started to get this feeling, wow, what is special about her? And then I realized she looked like my new niece. And I was thinking about her on a visceral level as a family member rather than as someone who necessarily would be an unusual candidate into being a Yale gospel choir. And scientists will tell you that we are shaped by our experience. We are shaped by the people that we see, the people that we know, and the more we are engaged in close relations across what people call our differences, the less likely I'm going to look at someone who may not look like me and think, oh my gosh, this is a problem. Because now I'm thinking about someone who didn't look like me, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, she looks like my niece. Now, marriage is not the answer for all of our problems with police departments, but the idea of establishing relationships and putting in place systems that build on relationships is a very important one. Brian Stevenson, who is one of our great Americans, says, it's about proximity. We're from New Jersey, so we say social change is a contact sport, but it's the same thing. Let's see, who was the next one at this table? I believe you in the blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Charles, and I'm a political science major here at Rider. You spoke a lot about community, and I just wanted to let you know, like Rider, we also agree with building community. We just recently changed our names from resident advisors to community assistants to focus more on building community.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm really happy about that.
Are you one?
Yes, I'm one.
There you go.
And we also you talked about being in Philadelphia the night before the election, and I was also at the same rally, and I heard Secretary Clinton's message on building community. However, I just wanted your opinion on, did voters believe that Donald Trump was the one to build community? And if so, are they satisfied or dissatisfied with his efforts thus far?
So I was in Philadelphia weeks before the election, not the night before the election. The polls say that most Americans don't think that Donald Trump is doing a great job in pulling us together. I tend to agree with those polls. There are some polls that suggest that a hard 36% or so actually believe that he's done more. And this is a poll that I saw a month and a half ago or so, that actually think that he has worked to pull us together. I don't know who that us is, because I just don't see it. We have had many presidents we've had at least a couple of presidents who did dog whistles, who would signal that they are prepared to divide us. When George Herbert Walker Bush ran against Michael Dukakis, he ran a set of campaign ads based on Willie Horton, who has been released early from prison and had committed a horrific crime afterwards. And that was a way to suggest that Michael Dukakis, the Democratic candidate, was unfit for office. Willie Horton was also African American, and his face featured prominently in these ads. That was kind of a dog whistle. And I think that Lee Atwater, who had been George Herbert Walker Bush's campaign manager, subsequently acknowledged that that was a problem. Before that, Ronald Reagan used to talk about he helped create the myth of the welfare queen. So it has been a component in a lot of different. It's been one of the ugliest aspects of our nation's life, our inability to deal with race. But most presidents, even when they're talking about dog whistles, and then they do these dog whistles, still at least talk about the language of coming together. We don't see that right now coming out of this White House. He's all in all the time, unless he's reading from a teleprompter. And the country is suffering for it. And the response is strengthening community, and not only having a rhetorical counter-response, but responding in a way that we are determined to live together, that will not reduce any of us to the other.
We've got time for one more.
Okay. I'll make my answer short, and we'll have time for two. So in the back, you've been waiting a long time.
Hi, my name is Erica Ryan. I'm a history professor here at Rider. And one of the things that really made you stand out to me in the primaries was your experience with the Brennan Center. And I was wondering if maybe you could say something about how that experience shaped the kind of campaign that you ran.
So the Brennan Center for Justice, and I was just there this morning because I'm doing work with them again, now that I have some time on my hands. The Brennan Center for Justice is part of NYU's law school, and they have focused, they're founded in the memory and the spirit of Justice William Brennan. They've focused on democracy and on justice issues, and within that, they have done work on making sure that that our democracy operates so that people actually have a voice and a choice in the democratic process. It means that over time we have represented John McCain, getting him on the ballot in New York, that the Brennan Center lawyer who later ended up running the Center for Reproductive Rights and is now my wife, she brought a case, I was co-counsel, representing a class of 600,000 people in Florida who had been denied the right to vote because of a prior felony conviction. Florida has the toughest disenfranchisement provisions for the formerly incarcerated in the country, and it dates back to the Jim Crow era in terms of its origins. So I came into the campaign with a particular view of how I think government functions best for all of us. I brought into it both a set of values that I grew up with, and if anything were refined within the crucible of the work of the Brennan Center, for sure. And I also had a pretty good sense of the approaches that get us into trouble. So, say the position that I took on money in politics, in part, was informed by my work with the Brennan Center, but in part was informed by my visit to Columbine. The idea that I could not get members of Congress to listen to what was a common sense reform of the gun show loophole, or after Sandy Hook, when again I was working then with the with Moms Demand Action, to persuade members of Congress to at least do something now. That wasn't happening because there was a boatload of money on the other side coming from the NRA. And even though we had data that showed that the majority of Americans, including NRA members that had been surveyed, were in favor of closing the gun show loophole, and we still couldn't get there, was because of money in politics. And so it wasn't just when I was taking that position, yes, it was about the campaign, but it was more broadly about how money gets in the way of citizens' voices. And it is part of what was driving the people that I was talking to on the stoop in Philadelphia to Donald Trump. Because they basically said the system does not work for us, and we're going to go with someone who's going to blow up the system. Now, there's a whole bunch of other people, and part of that 36 that thinks that he's brought us together. They're motivated by something very different, at least some of them. But there's a big swath of people that we need to think about that are simply disgusted. I think that our voters are not necessarily apathetic about politics. I think they're disgusted by it, and they turn it off. So that's how the Brenner Center shaped my campaign. You're the boss. Yes.
Oh, well, this says lawyer, activist, and former candidate. I want to know what you were going to do next in your activism. You said something about being at Brenner Center, but
I'm still figuring that out, but we working with the Brennan Center in October. We're bringing together law enforcement leaders from across the nation to talk about criminal justice reform, particularly in light of the shift in policies announced by Attorney General Sessions. And I'm going to continue to work at least in that vein. And I'm working with arts and social change activists as well. So I'm going to keep busy, that's for sure.
I want to thank Jim Johnson.
Thank
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Okay, good.
Appreciate it. People just want to schmooze with you.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm sure he'll walk slowly out the door, so if you want to grab him, take a selfie with him, this is your moment. Everyone, thank you for indulgence. We went longer than we usually do, but we got a solid hour here. So thank you all. If you've got time in next month on October 12th, we've got Kim Guadagno coming, very different kind of speaker, but she'll be coming in the afternoon. Our upcoming events are inside your program. Thank you all. Everybody have a safe trip home. We'll see you soon.